On September 5th, Sony Pictures chairman and CEO Tony Vinciquerra told Variety that for the moment, the door is closed for Spider-Man returning to the MCU. Is that a negotiation tactic, or does he really mean it? Has Sony taken Spider-Man back to keep him? If you've followed this channel for some time, you already know the answer to that, as we've warned that it was exceedingly likely that Sony would take Spider-Man back for the past year now. In this editorial, I'll ever so briefly recap why, before describing the 5 scenarios under which the door to Spider-Man returning to the MCU may be reopened. Before that though, you might have noticed a change in the videos YouTube recommend to you as of late. That is due to YouTube now giving corporate channels more exposure at the expense of independent channels like us, which means that we, and everyone like us, need help from our audience to grow further. So if you like what we do, please leave a like, leave a comment, help share, and if you're new here and find the content to your liking, then feel free to subscribe, smash that bell, and indicate that you want notifications. With that mandatory plug out of the way, let's move on to what's going on with Spider-Man. First of all, let's establish one thing. Sony are the ones primarily to blame for Spider-Man no longer being in the MCU. The initial story that Disney made such ridiculous demands that they practically forced Sony to withdraw from talks no longer holds water, as the ones who initially reported it, Deadline Hollywood, have since added further details to the story which effectively debunked that particular initial narrative. Disney may have gotten greedy and overplayed their hand, no argue there, but it was Sony that left them hanging for 6 months without attempting to find any middle ground or make any counteroffers. And now it is Sony that declares the door to any further deal with Marvel to be closed. The only takeaway from that is that Sony have already made their minds up and they don't want a new deal with Marvel. The reason I bring this up isn't to defend Disney or anything like that, but to emphasize the point that for a deal to happen, Sony has to want to return to the negotiating table. They have to want to be part of the MCU. Now you may wonder, why wouldn't they want to be part of the MCU, the biggest franchise of all time? Well, because of the financial success of Venom and the critical success of Into Spider-Verse. The success of those movies galvanized Sony into thinking they don't need Marvel anymore, and into thinking that they learned everything there is to learn from Kevin Feige. Now they can make their own Sony Marvel universe, drop Spider-Man in it, and dupe audiences into thinking it's all part of the MCU. So they'll all be as big a hits as the genuine MCU movies, but without Sony having to pay Marvel as much as a dime. So that's Sony's thinking here. From their point of view, Marvel fixed Spider-Man for them, but now that he has been fixed, and they have learned everything there is to learn from Marvel, their own Spidey universe will be as successful as the MCU. That looks great on paper, so why would they ever want to renew their deal with Marvel? There actually are a few ways Spider-Man could return to Marvel still. One would be that Sony fails to adhere to the stipulations of the Spider-Man movie license agreement, so that the movie rights simply revert back to Marvel. That would happen if Sony were to fail to have a new movie in front of cameras 3 years and 7 months since the release of the previous movie, or if they fail to release it 5 years and 7 months since the release of the previous movie. However, the odds of that happening in this climate are slim to none. So outside of that, I can think of 5 ways in which the door to Spider-Man returning to the MCU might reopen. Let's go through them, in order from least to most likely. The least likely way this can happen is by Marvel buying Sony out of their movie license agreement. What makes that so unlikely is that the Spider-Man movie rights are worth more to Sony than they are to Marvel, which in turn means that Sony's asking price would be far greater than Marvel or Disney would be willing to pay. There have been some reports claiming that Sony wouldn't part with the Spider-Man movie rights for less than $10 billion. That's more than what Disney paid for Marvel and Lucasfilm combined, and they would never part with such an amount for Spider-Man. You see, Marvel already owns everything Spider-Man but the movie rights. The Spider-Man merchandise alone already nets them hundreds of millions per year. So why would they part with an amount it would take them more than a decade, perhaps decades, to recoup just for the movie rights? Especially since they now have all the other movie rights, including for the Fantastic Four and X-Men. Even if Sony's asking price were lower or to come down, it is unlikely to come down to a point where Sony and Disney would agree on a price that would work for both parties. There have been some reports, admittingly of questionable veracity, but let's assume they are legit for the moment, that Sony would let Marvel put Spider-Man in MCU movies if they can have some MCU characters in return for their own movies, which would still be made without Marvel's involvement. Marvel reportedly offered a deal which would have allowed MCU characters to appear in Sony's movies, but then they wanted a 25% co-funding deal. This was the deal that Sony left them hanging for 6 months over. Giving into Sony's alleged demand, which again was giving up MCU characters without a co-funding deal, would be tantamount to letting Sony make legit MCU installments, which again would be tantamount to Kevin Feige letting Tom Rothman, of all people, playing in the MCU sandbox unsupervised. Yeah, that's not gonna happen. The movie industry is right now in a state of upheaval, where changes in the marketplace mean that only studios with an extensive catalog and technical infrastructure behind them will be contenders in the new marketplace. Case in point, Fox decided to sell off their entertainment division since they deemed the investment required to stay competitive wasn't worth it. By contrast, Disney bought Fox for their catalog to support their digital platforms in the long run. Likewise, Warner and Universal will do just fine being owned by AT&T and Comcast respectively. Sony, however, the movie division isn't really working out that well for Sony of Japan, so if a bidder were to offer the right price, the movie division could be sold off. Probably not to Disney. The Department of Justice might take issue with that in the aftermath of the Fox acquisition. But it doesn't matter. If anyone buys the movie division, whether it be Apple, Samsung, Huawei, CBS, or anyone else, Spider-Man would more likely than not revert back to Marvel. Sony has already indicated that they might have been willing to continue the previous ride-sharing deal under the same conditions as before. But Marvel didn't want that, as that meant they were left with only 5% of the gross of the Spider-Man movies, which they diverted significant resources into making. Had they only accepted that deal, which was good for them too, we might not have been in this mess right now. But alas, this is where they overplayed their hand. And now that Sony are committed to making their own Spider-Man universe, even that deal may no longer be on the table. But they still might be interested in a new deal which works out even better for them, meaning Disney has to give up more. For Marvel, this would mean a perhaps worse deal than the one they had, and that would be a bitter pill to swallow. For Sony, however, the reduction in risk working with Marvel comes with may, if conditions are right, be worth skipping their plans of going at it alone to build their own Sony Marvel universe. And that, my friends, ties right in with the most likely way Spider-Man will return to the MCU. Sony's Marvel Universe begun with Venom, and it will continue with Morbius, starring Jared Leto as the living vampire. Right now, Sony are galvanized by the success of Venom and Into Spider-Verse, and certain they learned everything there is to learn from Kevin Feige. However, witnessing, and perhaps after the fact understanding, what Kevin Feige did on Spider-Man Homecoming and Far From Home is not at all the same as suddenly trying to repeat his approach from the ground up. on another movie altogether. Morbius will be the litmus test on whether or not they have succeeded. If Morbius is a hit, then you can forget all about it. Spider-Man isn't going anywhere. But if Morbius underperforms or even flops, then Sony's resolve will be shaken. Then they will start to think, what if we can't do this? What if our attempts at making a Spider-Man universe fails this time too, just like last time? And if the powers that be at Sony Pictures don't think that, you can rest assured that the ones ultimately calling the shots at Sony Corporate in Japan will. They already know that with Marvel, Far From Home grossed $1 billion. If Sony's own movies fall too short of that, well, then Sony Corporate may very well instruct that they'd like to see a deal with Marvel come together, much like they did the last time. Until cameras roll on Sony's own Spider-Man soft reboot, there is still time for some kind of deal to come together. Of course, Sony will do everything in their power to ensure Morbius is a hit. You can expect the Marvel logo to be displayed prominently in the movie's marketing campaign. And I would not rule out the Spider-Man appearance, even if Morbius already is done filming. In an upcoming video, I'll detail not just how Spider-Man could appear in Morbius despite the movie already having been filmed, but why it's even likely that he will. Till then, let me know if you think Spider-Man will ultimately return to Marvel, and if so, under what circumstances, in the comments.